Hey, it's Jacob. I'm excited to announce that my brand new book, Leading with Vulnerability, is now available for pre-order. And I can promise you that after reading it, you will never think about and approach leadership the same way ever again. This book flips the conventional ideas and wisdom of vulnerability on its head. In fact, I argue that you should not be vulnerable at work, but instead you should lead with vulnerability. And there is a very clear and specific distinction between those two. Now, how do you do it? How do you approach it? How do you tap into vulnerability in the right way? Because there is a right and a wrong way to do it. To figure that out, I surveyed over 14,000 employees and I interviewed over 100 CEOs at companies around the world. And I put all of that together into my brand new book, aptly called Leading with Vulnerability, which you can now pre-order. It's coming out October 3rd, but you can now pre-order a copy by going to leadwithvulnerability.com. And if you grab a hardcover copy, I will give you access to a couple exclusive CEO interviews, including those with the CEOs of GE, the CEOs of American Airlines, Edward Jones, and a couple others. I'll give you a sneak peek of the book. I'll send you a few chapters of it, and I'll invite you to a private and exclusive webinar that I am hosting, which will take place before the book comes out, so I can introduce some of the concepts and ideas to you. Again, all of this is available by going to leadwithvulnerability.com.
I don't have a beef with Jack the man. And I really took pains to make this book, I hope, about a system and about an economy and about a way of living that we're all a part of.
My guest today, David Gellis, he wrote a best-selling book called The Man Who Broke Capitalism, How Jack Welch Gutted the Heartland and Crushed the Soul of Corporate America, and How to Undo His Legacy. What's your beef with Jack?
My beef with Jack is that at the end of the day, he, more than anyone else, is the individual I believe is responsible for so many of the problems we have in our economy today. When you look at anything from income inequality to the way that corporations run roughshod over communities, to the way that they treat their workers as a cost rather than an asset, Jack Welch is the one that set the precedent.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Great Leadership. My guest today, David Gellis, he wrote a best-selling book, which I've been getting actually a few requests to get you on the show, David. And the name of the book is called The Man Who Broke Capitalism, How Jack Welch Gutted the Heartland and Crushed the Soul of Corporate America, and How to Undo His Legacy. It's a very it's a very brutal title of a book. David, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So of course, first I have to ask, what's your beef with Jack?
You know, I don't have a beef with Jack the man. And I really took pains to make this book one that was not so much about an individual as it was, I hope, about a system and about an economy and about a way of living that we're all a part of. But since you asked, my beef with Jack is that at the end of the day, he, more than anyone else, is the individual I believe is responsible for so many of the problems we have in our economy today. When you look at anything from income inequality to the way that corporations run roughshod over communities, to the way that they treat their workers as a cost rather than an asset, Jack Welch is the one that set the precedent.
Let's start off with business before Jack, and then we can talk about some of the things that Jack actually did. So before Jack was CEO, and you're talking about income inequality and things like that, what was it like before Jack, I guess you could say, influenced his reign or made all these changes?
So we have to go all the way back in history to the post-war years. And I try not to be overly Pollyannish about this. There were always problems. There were deep inequities. Minorities and women did not have nearly an equitable share of the economic pie. So let's say all of that up front. it's also true that big corporations had a fundamentally different relationship with their workers and with their communities than they do now. The presiding ethos of the day, from call it the late 40s through the early 70s, was that what was good for the company was good for the country, and vice versa. So it wasn't this winner-take-all mentality where corporations were trying to maximize their short-term profits at the expense of everything else.
Yeah.
You know, like society and communities and the health of our national balance sheet be damned. There was a sense that we were all in it together. And what that did was inform decisions about how CEOs treated their workers, how they compensated their workers, you know, what they considered when it was time to make a big acquisition, or what it was, you know, what was on the table when something went wrong, right? When profits dipped, was the reflexive instinct to turn to mass layoffs and fire 20,000 people? Like, it wasn't. That's not what happened until Jack came around. So again, I don't want to overly romanticize it, but it's important to know that there was a different version of capitalism that was really, you know, the prevailing ethos for the sort of glory days, the heyday of the late 20th century, when a lot of people think this country was at its best.
Yeah. But, you know, back in the day, we also had things like, or people like Frederick Winslow Taylor, and we had these ideas of, you know, unless you're a manager, you're too stupid to know the role of your job, and you should really just be focusing on the task, not about, you know, kind of the management, the leadership aspect, and let's try to shave seconds off of the tasks that you're doing. So there were some challenges too in the past, but it sounds like what you're saying is Jack really kind of blew things up with a lot of the things that he implemented.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways we can look at this very complex thing of like what is work and who was doing it at what level of a corporation at any moment in history. To your point, there's no doubt that there was probably not the same opportunity for individuals on the front line to make an impact at a big organization. I think Jack deserves some credit for that. His whole work out philosophy was really rooted in trying to get frontline men and women the tools and the autonomy they needed to fix company-wide processes that maybe weren't going as well. I think it's also true that, you know, there was certainly entrepreneurial spirit in America back then, but we didn't have anywhere near the sort of dynamic, vibrant economy and the startup culture that we have today. Yeah. So again, like, not saying everything was perfect back then. However, I keep coming back, and really the through line of this book is when a corporation is making millions or hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars in profits each year, how are they allocating it? What are they doing with those profits? Like, who benefits? And the undisputable truth is that back in what, again, sort of was called the golden age of capitalism, perhaps overly romanticized, they were giving more money to workers. Yeah. They were giving more money to the government in the form of taxes. They were taking better care of their communities. They were investing in cities like Schenectady and Erie and Cincinnati instead of reflexively turning to offshoring and outsourcing. And therein, in my mind, lies a huge part of the meta-narrative of this country for the last several generations, the last 75 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. While you were talking, I was also looking up the pay gap of the 60s versus what it is today. And I guess in the 60s, the pay gap was 21-1, meaning the CEO would make 21 times as much as, I believe, is it the lowest, is the official criteria, the lowest paid employee?
No, it's the median.
Oh, the median
employee. It's not the lowest.
Yeah, 21 times the median. And today it is closer to 351 times the median. So it's ridiculous. It seems like more money is going to the CEOs than ever before.
And it gets a lot higher than that at some of our best known companies. I've written about CEO compensation for years now. And I remember there was a moment when I did the story. There's always like a news cycle around this, usually sort of mid-year-ish, when all the proxies are finally out, like April or so. And the Walmart, Doug McMillon, who is doing a lot of good stuff, right? And I think is trying to do right by his associates in many ways. But let's face it, right? That ratio, which is an SEC mandated disclosure now, was like 1,000 to 1. So Doug McMillon was making in 1 year what it would take his median associate 1,000 years to make. But there's nothing like there's no way I think that feels good for an individual contributor. I can't imagine it feels good for management. And it certainly doesn't feel right for society.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, let's talk about some of the unique practices that Jack implemented. I think you talk about a couple in the book: downsizing, deal-making, financialization. And, a lot of people hear stories of Jack, and they probably know that he was known as Neutron Jack. But I also don't think a lot of people really know exactly what Jack did. And that's why I like some of the way that you unpacked it in the book. And even I had no idea about a lot of these things. So maybe we can jump into some of those practices. Are those the three main ones? Did I get those right? Downsizing, deal-making, financialization?
Yeah. Thank you for reading so closely. And those are sort of the three pillars of what I sort of describe as Welchism, right?
Yeah.
I got to invent my own verbiage for this book.
So let's talk a little bit about what those are. So let's start off with downsizing. So what did he do, and why is downsizing such a bad thing? Because we hear about that. That phrase is used all the time in corporate America. Anytime a company's going through layoffs, we're downsizing, we're letting people go. It's kind of like daily business jargon.
Yeah. Layoffs can be necessary. I've never run a business. So, who am I to say that a company can't lay off its workers? I'm not that naive. I've been writing about business for 15 years. I get it, right? There are moments when the numbers don't work, and headcount reduction is like an unfortunate necessity. But that's not what Jack did. When Jack Welch took over General Electric in 1981, the company had just printed a $1 billion annual profit.
Billion?
Which is billion with a B. Pretty darn good for 1980, right? Pretty darn good. And the stock hadn't moved much in the last decade, to be sure. There was certainly a lot of change afoot in the global economy, right? The post-war era was shifting. Wall Street was coming online with new and more innovative products. Germany and Japan were out there as real industrial competitors. So there was a sense that things were going to change, but GE was doing just fine when he took it over. But what did he do? If you look at those first couple of years, he was running GE. He unleashed a wave of downsizing and mass layoffs and factory closures, the likes of which corporate America had simply never seen before. We are talking tens, or depending on how you count it, even hundreds of thousands of jobs eliminated in a matter of months. And he did it, this is what's so critical, he did it not because those businesses were failing. He did it because he wanted to reduce headcount, reduce the amount of money GE was spending on its people, and tighten the business in a way that allowed it to focus on only the most profitable divisions. And you might say, like, well, what's wrong with that? Well, in principle, nothing. But the end result was, by doing that much downsizing, mostly layoff, but also a certain amount of outsourcing and offshoring, in such a short amount of time, he fundamentally destabilized the American middle class. It just got to the point where, whole towns that had their economies essentially built around GE suddenly had the rugs pulled out from under them. And that, of course, is when, to your earlier point, Newsweek in 1983 dubbed him Neutron Jack, because there was this sense that like the neutron bomb, when it purportedly went off, the buildings would still be standing, but there were no people left inside. And that immediate wave of downsizing was so shocking to corporate America. Yeah, it got the attention of 60 Minutes and Newsweek, which did stories about it. But it also critically gave cover for other CEOs to start doing the same thing. Because here we got to just, if you'll permit me, take a little history lesson and understand that GE, for most of the 20th century, had been the most important company in corporate America.
Iconic
it was the one
brand.
Forget being an iconic brand. Yes, it made toaster ovens and refrigerators and jet engines and x-ray machines and everything you could imagine. But inside the world of management, in the world of the CEOs and business schools, it was really the pace setter. As GE went, so went the rest of corporate America. And its CEO always had this sort of outsized ability to set the tone for corporate America. And what that CEO did was sort of okay for other CEOs to do. And other companies would mirror GE's org charts and its training apparatuses. Yeah. And so when Jack gets out there and starts firing people by the tens and 50,000s, other CEOs say, oh, we can do that too.
So it seems like what Jack Welch did, it's not the fact that he did these things, but he did it not because the businesses were struggling. He was doing it to, like you said, kind of tighten the business and to make the balance sheet look even better. So it's maybe the reasons why he was doing it as opposed, like, for example, let's say GE was on the verge of bankruptcy. They had to close all these plants. They had to let go of tens, hundreds, thousands of employees. In that case, maybe it would have been more understanding or realistic for why they were doing it. But it sounds like what you're saying is the company was profitable, the business was doing well, and Jack just went in there and said, you know what? I want to be looking even better. And that's why we're going to let go of all these people and shut down all these factories and mess things up.
That's right. And I mean, he was chasing margins and he was chasing quarterly earnings. And listen, like, even questioning that, I recognize, is like blasphemous, right? In capitalist America, because it's so ingrained that, like, well, yeah, that's what it's all about, dummy. But what I try to remind people in this book is, like, that's actually not what it has to be all about. Yeah. B, there's no law that says that's what it's all about. This notion that, like, you have to put shareholders first, everything else be damned, is like a collective illusion that people have created. And C, right, doing so has consequences. You spend 20 years as CEO, as he did, putting profits first and people last. Like, there are real effects on culture, on communities, and ultimately on the business itself.
Yeah. It's funny because depending on who you talk to, some people say he was like the greatest CEO of the generation, and some people were like, this guy was a complete bastard. He caused so much harm. So I find it very interesting that there's two sides of this. And I've interviewed a lot of CEOs on this podcast who've worked with or for Jack Welch. One of them was Frank Blake, the former CEO of the Home Depot. And he told me that you never took a meeting with Jack Welch sitting down because he would get, fired up and you'd kind of be like pacing while you're on the phone with him. And it's funny, the conversations frequently separate between Jack Welch as the person versus Jack Welch as sort of the CEO and the business decisions that he made. Yeah. So why do you think that's the case? And I'm also really curious, do you think if Jack Welch was not the CEO of GE, let's say he was the CEO of, I don't know, Pepsi or some other brand that wasn't maybe as influential in the world as GE was at the time, would his impact have been the same? Like, was it more of a Jack Welch thing or more of the fact that he was the CEO of a GE thing?
Like I alluded to earlier, GE was singularly influential. Yeah. And so that's part of my argument, is that the fact that this one individual had so much influence and such an extreme posture, an extreme playbook at the most influential company in corporate America, that created this situation where he has really unmatched influence on the last 50 years of American capitalism, I would argue. Yeah. And to your point, you've interviewed lots of people who worked with him. He minted more proteges than absolutely any other CEO.
Which is crazy.
Right? Unbelievable run and influence. And that, in in my research, it became so clear he was able to spread his fingerprints all over the economy because these men, and they were almost all men, took his playbook and went and did the exact same damn thing at all these other companies. Whether it was Jim McNerney at 3M and Boeing, whether it was Bob Nardelli at Home Depot and Chrysler, whether it was Dave Calhoun, who's still to this day running Boeing, having previously been CEO at Nielsen and done serious stints at lots of other companies. These men are all over the economy, dozens and dozens of them, which I catalog in the book, and almost to a man, they did the exact same thing. They got in there, they immediately did a round of headcount reductions to try to boost margins. They used deal making to try to create tons of inorganic growth and sort of drive up the stock price.
Let's jump into deal making actually, because that was the second one. So what exactly is deal making?
I mean, we all know what deal making is on this podcast, right? You're like buying and selling companies. I got my start as an M&A reporter, so I was in the trenches with these, deal makers.
Well, why is it bad? Why is deal making? Why was the way Jack did it bad?
Well, two different questions, right? Far be it for me to say that deal making is inherently bad. I get there are good acquisitions, of course. The way he did it, though, it's all about the why, right? The way he did it and why he did it is crucial here. He was doing it to essentially grow GE's top line in the service of growing its stock price, right? We all know that there is a correlation between just, revenue and overall market cap. Inevitably, right? Seems natural. That was not lost on him. And when he went looking for growth with this intention to make GE the most valuable company in the world, he understood early on, organic growth wasn't going to get him there. He could sell all the refrigerators he wanted. It was never going to be the biggest company in the world. So he goes looking for targets. He goes after RCA, right, which gives him essentially monopolistic share in certain industrial businesses, gets him NBC as well, gets him into the media business. He goes after Kidder Peabody, which gets him into the finance business way deeper than GE, what had been this tiny little unit of GE Capital, but gives him sort of the building blocks to go and do what was the majority of his acquisitions, all of which were in the service of GE Capital. Turning what was effectively like a small little loans business, helping companies amortize the purchase of a big industrial piece of equipment into what was effectively, by the time he retired in 2001, an unregulated bank. Right? They had commercial real estate portfolios, they had Thai auto loans, they had high interest credit cards, they were doing private equity, bridge loans, they were doing everything you could imagine. And it was absolutely the furthest thing you could imagine from the GE we all have in our imagination, right? The GE that helped put people on the moon. You go back and watch the Apollo 13 footage, there's GE engineers in there. The GE that helped America win World War II with sophisticated radar technologies and early jet engines. The GE that made possible transatlantic flight with real jet engines on the wings of Boeing wide-body jets. That was the GE that Jack Welch turned his back on. Instead, he was fascinated by Wall Street, and he tried to make his company as near a real competitor to the big investment banks that he envied as he could.
So was the problem with his approach with deal making, because obviously he made a ton of acquisitions, but it sounds like what you're saying is he made the acquisitions purely to drive the top line numbers and then kind of turned his back on those companies, or what? Because some people might be listening to this thinking, well, so what's wrong with that? He made a bunch of acquisitions. He grew this big business. Well, I don't get it.
But he took what was an industrial company and turned it into a financial company. And in doing so, he let go of what I argue is the DNA of GE. You look back for the first 100, the majority of the first 100 years of this company, and it was the best maker and designer of industrial products in America, right? It was the most important industrial company in the century when America defined its dominance in the world by its industrial and manufacturing prowess. He turned his back on that. And as he was spending all this money, I have this quote in the book, right, from the former CEO of the financial services division, Gary Wendt. He says, we would all get together, all the heads of the different divisions, and he would tell everyone else to shrink their business, to stop spending on R&D, and he would tell me, the financial portion, to grow, grow, grow. And so we saw R&D fall off. We saw GE start to sell its historic appliance businesses, the lighting business. All the businesses that had like defined GE were cast aside over the years. And it got to the point where, you know, in pursuit of margins and trying to make GE Capital ever bigger, General Electric in 2005, admittedly shortly after Welch had retired, goes out and buys WMC, Western Asset Management Corporation, the largest holder of subprime mortgages, right? Like that's the kind of assets GE was getting after with once Jack Welch took over.
Yeah.
And
it's like we all know an aerospace company.
Yeah, I would say it's like McDonald's buying like fucking cryptocurrency.
Yeah, it's just like out of left field. It doesn't make sense.
It was ephemeral and it had nothing to do with who they were all about.
So what was the impact of that? So, you know, you could chalk that up to just, well, you know, Jack was just making some bad business decisions and, you know, he made mistakes and this and that. But did that have negative repercussions on the economy, on GE as a company, on the lives of employees? Like what was the outcome of this deal making that he was doing?
Well, one of the most remarkable things, and no one will ever take this away from him, and I don't try to in the book, is that he got away with this. You know, this playbook worked for most of his 20 years as CEO. He did make General Electric the most valuable company in the world. He did keep it there for like the better part of a decade. He did go out close to the top. And it's also true that I mean, it's legend at this point, but Jeff Immelt's second full day on the job was September 11th, 2001. Yep. So, you know, Jack always had a knack for timing. He got out at just the right moment.
I had Jeff on the podcast too as well.
Yeah. And I talked to Jeff at length for this book. So, you know, we have gone back and forth about this subject matter for years and years. And I, you know, a lot of respect for him. And he's got his version of what happened, and this is mine. But so in that moment, right, in those tragic and complicated and confusing months after September 11th, 2001, one of the many things that happened is that analysts, other executives started looking really closely at what GE was all about, and they really didn't like what they saw, right? Bill Gross, the bond king, he suddenly is like, I'm out. He, you know, for so long, a booster of GE really digs in and he realizes, wait, this like looks like a house of cards. And what they see is that, you know, a generation of starving the industrial divisions of R&D, of failing to be on the leading edge of product development, of failing to invest in the workforce, of becoming ever more reliant on suppliers and at times inferior overseas manufacturing operations, has left GE in that moment with a real crisis. They were not nearly as competitive as they needed to be. And the one division that had had the undisputed mandate to grow, GE Capital, was totally exposed in a world turned upside down by the terrorist attacks. And that moment, which is really the beginning of Jeff Immelt's tenure, marks the beginning of the end for the company, which is, of course, today in the process of being broken up once and for all.
Yeah. I mean, today it's, who knows what's even going on over there. It's hard to even keep track. But it seems like
well, they're splitting it up, right? There were 3 divisions left, and they're selling them, right? There are 3 independent companies. They're spinning them out one by one. There's going to be aircraft engines, there's going to be medical devices, and there's going to be power. And who knows, right? Like, do those get gobbled up by private equity? But what we know is that General Electric, as we know it, the General Electric that was, you know, founded with Thomas Edison as a core part of its DNA. The General Electric that was a paragon of modern management philosophy for all of the 20th century. The General Electric that at one point accounted for 1% of the gross domestic product of the United States of America. The General Electric that Jack Welch took over with $1 billion profit in 1981. That General Electric is gone forever.
I started out with a very basic question when I wrote this book. Is vulnerability for leaders the same as it is for everybody else? And it turns out the answer to that is no. So how do the world's top leaders tap into vulnerability in the right way so that they can lead through change, unlock the potential of others, drive business performance, create trust? If you want to find out, pre-order your copy by going to leadwithvulnerability.com, and you'll get access to some really cool bonuses there as well. Again, that's leadwithvulnerability.com. Inside of an organization or for a leader, what do you think some of the variables are that encourage vulnerability?
First of all, leading by example. And secondly, when you see somebody struggle or when you, on a certain area, saying, hey, buddy, it's okay, in front of a group, it's okay.
Be courageous enough to ask for help.
People have got to admit that we're not all perfect.
The leaders' jobs are really to make sure that the teams that you create are in a safe environment and you've got diversity of view is genuinely encouraged.
It's interesting. It's almost like he tried to be Amazon before Amazon was Amazon. Like he tried to be the everything company to everybody, which is kind of like what Amazon's trying to do. I mean, it's Amazon is in every, I was saying rockets to space. I mean, they're in every nook and cranny that you can think of, which is kind of interesting because maybe Jeff Bezos approached it in a different way. But it seems to me like what Jack Welch did is he focused a lot on the short term without looking at the long term of where the company's going in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. He was just and that's probably a good case study of what happens when you focus on short-term value instead of long-term growth. But I don't know how much you follow anything that Jeff Bezos is doing. Do you see any comparison there? Like, is Jeff Bezos just approaching it differently? Because when you look at the stuff that he's doing, to me, it seems very similar to maybe what Jack Welch did, not in terms of downsizing necessarily, but the deal-making side, like getting into every possible business.
In the book, I make it clear there's no obvious and perfect comparison between a company today and a company like GE at its heyday. But I say in the book, the nearest approximation is Amazon.
Yeah.
And I say that for some of the reasons you mentioned just now, but I really focus not on the strategy so much as I do on the treatment of the workers. And when you look at the way that Jeff Bezos, from the inception of Amazon, tried to create an arm's length distance with his workers to the point where, the churn at a lot of the warehouses is over 100% a year. There's literally they cannot keep someone for a year. We've done a bunch of reporting on this at the New York Times, showing just how brutal and thankless and tireless those jobs are. That has such distinct echoes to me of what was known at GE as the campaign against loyalty, right? Early on in Jack Welch's tenure, as he went to the war with the unions, as he unleashed this wave of downsizing, as he made it clear that no one was safe at a company where you could previously sort of have expected lifetime employment, it was called internally the campaign against loyalty.
Wow.
And when I see what Bezos has done, in systematically creating a culture that disincentivizes people from really staying with the company in a way to limit the organization's exposure to the high cost of labor in this country. Well, that is, in my mind, like just about the nearest approximation as you can get to Jack Welch today.
The last element, and I guess we kind of touched on this, was the financialization. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, we did. I mean, that to me all comes back to GE Capital. GE Capital existed before Jack Welch took over. It was called something else, but basically it was a little division inside the company that would issue essentially loans to corporations if they wanted to spread out the purchase price of a big piece of industrial equipment over, months or even years. What he saw in these early 80s, as Wall Street is suddenly a totally different animal. Animal spirits were stirring out there. There was all this interest, all this new understanding of what could happen. Now that technology was being able to move money around. The global economy was getting integrated with the American economy. He understood. And he says this in his autobiography. He says, after a life, I'm going to get this a little wrong, but he says something to the effect of, after a life of like bending steel, I understood it was a lot easier to make money with money than it was by trying to bend some steel. And there was just this innate, accurate recognition that if you're in financial services and you can come out on the other end of trade, I mean, just look at private equity and hedge funds today. If you're taking 2 and 20, it's sort of hard to screw up that business. And that's a business model that looks a heck of a lot better to Jack Welch than refrigerators. But Jack Welch didn't get hired to run a bank. Jack Welch got hired to run GE. And so therein lies sort of this like cardinal sin, and I didn't say it quite like this in the book, but it's almost like, he got hired for one job and did a different one at the end of the day.
Bait and switch, huh?
Right? And most people get fired for that. But the upshot is he made a lot of money for himself, a lot of money for some of his executives, a lot of money for GE shareholders if you bought at the right time and sold at the right time. But you got to think about those GE pensioners who thought that giving their lives to this company was going to be worth it at the end, and then saw the value of their shareholdings just plummet once people understood what was really going on at that company. And those people were left high and dry as Jack Welch was like still living in Trump Tower, getting all of his amenities paid for by today's GE shareholders.
Do you think part of this comes back to the debate between shareholder versus stakeholder value?
Yeah, absolutely. And I get into that towards the end of the book. And I don't think, it's not black and white, right? Shareholders are a really important stakeholder. And I am not one to sit here and say, like, I don't believe in profits and we shouldn't have profits, right? I work for a for-profit company and I'm proud and grateful when we're turning a profit, because then we have money to reinvest in the important work we do and spread the wealth a bit. All good things. It's all about the extremes though, right? Jack Welch did it to the extreme and to the exclusion. He focused on shareholders to the exclusion of all other stakeholders. And this is this sort of perverted view, perverted interpretation of the Milton Friedman phrase from the 1971 New York Times essay, the social responsibility of a business is to increase its profits. That line, which has somewhat been taken out of context, not entirely, but somewhat, has over the years become a justification for all manner of corporate bad behavior. And Jack was like public enemy number one when it came to that offense. He took that aphorism, which he repeats in his own autobiography, and uses it as a justification for turning his back and his company's back on the people that made it great, on the communities that had played home to its factories and its offices for so long. And ultimately, I argue, turning its back on the whole country.
How would you change that statement then? I mean, if you said that the purpose of an organization is to make more money for shareholders, but in a human way, would that be more applicable? Or is it no longer just about making the greatest profit that you can? Because as you know, there's a big debate today. I think you've written about this as part of your column as well, but whether you look at DEI or whether you look at corporate social responsibility, you look at ESG, it's a very, very polarizing topic, right? Where some people say the role of business, they should stay out of these issues, and it's not up to the business to decide where my money goes. It's not up to the business to, focus on social causes. Like, that's not where the business goes. I just care about making as much money with the company as possible. And then the flip side of that is other people say, no, businesses should be investing in those social causes and DEI. And it's like this very polarizing debate. I'm curious to hear where you stand on that.
Yeah, it sure is. And listen, it's far be it for me to like be the one to decide the verdict on that grand debate, right? So I won't dodge it, but I also want to distinguish a couple different things. Let's come back to businesses and their role in the social and political and culture wars debates. That's a real and important issue, but in my mind, it's actually separate from what we're talking about here. We're talking about, in my mind, when we talk about how Jack Welch ran GE, the choices he made, the trade-offs he made, it really gets down to that framework I had earlier in the conversation of like, great, a company's making $1 billion. How are you spending it, right? Who benefits? How are you distributing those profits? In my mind, the real question is, if you're returning a ton of capital to shareholders in the form of buybacks or dividends, are you doing so knowing that all the people in your stack are taken care of? The question I always like to ask CEOs is, what is life like for the person on your payroll who makes the least amount of money? Really? I mean, like, that's a serious question. And a lot of them don't have an answer for that because they don't even know. And a lot of CEOs, when they really get right with themselves and ask that question in an open way and look at the answer head on, they do not like what it feels like. Yeah. They do not like what it looks like. And that's a powerful moment because many CEOs that go through that journey actually then wind up making big changes and taking better care of their workers. And that to me is super powerful. So listen, profits are great. Yeah. But are you making a profit while also taking care of your people? That's the real question I'm trying to ask in this book.
And I agree. And
that's separate from the social stuff.
Yeah. And I also know you write about climate and stuff like that on your art. I mean, you covered about a lot of different things as far as the role that business plays, the role that politics plays and all this. So I'm really curious to get your thoughts on some of these topics too. But to your point, I completely agree, right? I mean, as long as the business is taking care of its people, like inside the organization, like that's, I think, a huge, huge priority. I think the question becomes, what about outside the business? Should the organization play a role in anything outside the business, outside of the people who work there?
Listen, every company's got its own answer for that. Yeah. And there truly is no right or wrong answer to this. The CEOs who tell you we are leaning into this will tell you we need to because my employees expect me to. And when Texas passes an abortion ban and I don't say anything, I get lots of emails from my employees in Texas. And they're wondering why I don't have their back. And that's a powerful, real dynamic. Other CEOs will tell you, you know what? Like, I am here to run a business. I'm here to deliver a product and a service and take care of you good employees and take care of my shareholders. But I am not going to use my voice or the company's voice to wade into really charged issues where, irrespective of your politics, there are very strong feelings about really, really intense topics, whether it be abortion or gun ownership in this country or immigration, right? Like, in our own little corner, we may feel like there's only one right answer to it, but the truth is like half the country feels the other way. Yeah. And so these are active social debates. The CEOs that I think have had the most success in navigating this very sort of fraught cultural waters are those that early on, absent a crisis, when they are not in the headlines and they have the sort of the clarity of and the time to think and be deliberate, it's the ones who say, here's what our company's about. Here's our history. Here's our industry. Here's our product. Here's our legacy. Here's the 2 or 3 things we really care about. And that might be public health. That might be safety. That might be, child mental well-being. There's like any number of legitimate issues where corporations may feel like they have a uniquely powerful role to play in a societal debate that is a benefit of their many years of really studying the issue, of working in those communities. The CEOs who say, like, here are issues, when stuff comes up in these lanes, yeah, we're going to take a stand and you can take it or leave it. But we're not going to take a stand on every issue just because some of our employees may feel that way. Those are the CEOs and those are the companies that, in my estimation, seem to be sort of navigating all of this with the most success these days.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I interview a lot of CEOs on here, and sometimes, when the camera's not rolling, they're candidly telling me, they're like, yeah, we don't know what the best option is. Like, it's this world of like cancel culture. People are going to come after you, but people want you to speak up. And it's kind of like, where do you go? With social media and technology, it's so easy for anybody to come after you at any time. So we have a few minutes left. Usually the last part of the show, I like to transition to something called the Leader's Toolkit, where we talk about more actionable stuff that people can implement in their leadership journeys. And so for this episode of the Leader's Toolkit, I wanted to start off by talking about what specifically leaders today, not necessarily CEOs, can learn from Jack Welch. And maybe we could start with anything good. Was there anything good that Jack Welch did that you would advise leaders today to also do in their organizations or in their teams? If you want more of my conversation with David Gellis, as well as many of my other amazing guests, CEOs, best-selling authors, thinkers, and leaders, head over to greatleadership.substack.com. Every single week, we release one of these bonus episodes, and in a few weeks, we will release the one with David Gellis, where we talk about what Jack Welch did well, so some of the good things that he did, as well as some of the bad things that he did and what leaders can learn from that. We're also going to look at how to fix and change some of the approaches that Jack Welch implemented, and what are some of the alternatives to the Jack Welch approach. Again, this will be coming out in a few weeks, but in the meantime, we release one of these every single week, as well as something called What I Learned This Week, and the 5-Minute Leader, which is a short 5-minute video where I share a leadership hack and a tip that a CEO has shared with me. If you want to get access to all of this and much more, including my best content and my latest thinking, again, that is greatleadership.substack.com. We have an awesome community over there. I hope to see you there.